The haunting melody floated through the night air, drawing Mason Hayes closer to the ramshackle saloon at the edge of Skidoo, California. The year was 1878, and Mason had been riding for days, his body aching from the saddle and his mind weary from the solitude of the trail. The song stopped him in his tracks, a woman's voice, pure as mountain water but laden with a sorrow that made his heart catch. Mason tied his horse to the hitching post and approached the dim light spilling from the saloon windows. Through the dusty glass, he saw her, a slender woman with copper hair, standing on a small stage, singing to a room full of empty chairs. Her eyes were closed, her hands clasped at her heart as if in prayer, and the beauty of her voice seemed almost sacrilegious in this forgotten corner of the desert. Without thinking, Mason pushed through the bat-wing doors. The hinges creaked, announcing his arrival, but the woman didn't stop singing. He removed his hat, holding it respectfully against his chest, and took a seat at one of the empty tables. For a moment, he thought she hadn't noticed him, but then her eyes opened, met his across the room, and still she sang, the melody unwavering despite the surprise that flickered across her features. The song was unfamiliar to Mason, something about lost love and enduring hope, themes that resonated deep within him though he'd never admit it to his fellow cowboys. When the final note faded into silence, the woman stood motionless, regarding him with wary curiosity. "Evening, madam," Mason said, his voice rough from days of little use. "Hope I'm not intruding." "The saloon's closed," she replied, her speaking voice carrying the same melodic quality as her singing, though now edged with caution. "Has been for nearly a month." "I heard your voice from the road," Mason explained. "Couldn't help myself." He gestured to the empty chairs around him. "Do you often sing for such a distinguished audience?" A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "They're more reliable than most living patrons. They don't shout requests or throw bottles when they're displeased." She stepped down from the small stage, moving behind the bar. "Since you're here, can I offer you a drink? I'm Fiona Thornton, by the way. This was my husband's place." "Mason Hayes," he replied, noting her use of was. "And I'd be grateful for whatever you're willing to spare. Been a long ride from Sacramento." Fiona poured amber liquid into 2 glasses, bringing them to his table. She sat across from him, her posture straight but her eyes revealing exhaustion. "What brings you to Skidoo, Mr. Hayes?" "We don't get many travelers these days, not since the mine started drying up." Mason took a sip, appreciating the burn of good whiskey. "Just passing through on my way to Arizona Territory. Got some cattle business in Tombstone." He studied her face in the lamplight. She couldn't be more than 25, too young for the grief that had etched itself around her eyes. "If you don't mind my asking, Mrs. Thornton, why sing to an empty saloon?" She looked down at her glass, rotating it slowly between her fingers. "My husband, Edward, died 3 months ago. Fever took him in just 4 days." Her voice remained steady, though Mason could hear the effort it took. "This place was his dream. I can't bear to leave it dark and silent, even if there's no one to serve anymore." She gestured around the room. "So I sing. I pretend the chairs are filled with the miners and cowboys who used to keep this place lively. Some nights I can almost hear them cheering." Mason nodded, understanding more than she might have guessed. Music has a way of filling empty spaces. "It does," Fiona agreed, meeting his eyes again. "Though it's strange to have a real person listening for a change. If it's all the same to you, madam, I'd be honored to listen a while longer." And so she sang again, and Mason listened, the night slipping away as her voice wove stories of love and loss, of the frontier and the hearts that braved its harshness. He had only planned to stay for 1 song, perhaps 2, but found himself unable to leave. There was something about Fiona Thornton's voice, about the dignity with which she performed for a room of ghosts, that spoke to a loneliness within himself he'd rarely acknowledged. When she finally stopped, the oil in the lamps burning low, Mason realized he'd spent hours entranced. "You have a remarkable gift, Mrs. Thornton." "Fiona, please," she said, her reserve softening slightly. "And thank you. Music was always my refuge, even as a girl. My father was a minister in Boston, and I sang in his church choir before." She trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. "Before I decided the West held more promise than another winter in Massachusetts." "How did you end up in Skidoo?" "I met Edward on the stagecoach to San Francisco. He was charming, full of dreams about striking it rich in the goldfields." A fond smile crossed her face. "He never did find gold, but when we heard about the silver strikes here, he decided a saloon would be a surer bet than mining. He was right for a while. Then the main vein played out and the town started emptying." She glanced around the saloon. "We were just discussing whether to move on when he fell ill." Mason nodded, understanding the cruel timing of fate. "And now I'm trying to decide what to do with a saloon in a dying town." Her smile turned rueful. "Hence the singing to empty chairs, putting off decisions, I suppose." "Where would you go if you left?" Fiona sighed. "That's just it. I have no family left back east. Edward's people never approved of him marrying a minister's daughter with no dowry. Here, at least, I have a roof and walls that are mine." She stood, collecting their glasses. "You must be tired, Mr. Hayes. We have rooms upstairs. They're nothing fancy, but they're clean. You're welcome to stay the night." Mason hesitated. He'd planned to make camp outside town, saving his money for necessities. But the thought of a real bed after weeks on the trail was tempting. "I'd be much obliged, but I don't want to impose. It's no imposition. The rooms sit empty otherwise." She walked toward the stairs. "Consider it payment for being such an attentive audience." Mason followed, carrying his saddlebags. The upper floor held 6 small rooms, simple but, as she'd promised, clean. Fiona lit a lamp in one and handed it to him. "There's a washroom at the end of the hall if you'd like to clean up. Breakfast is at sunrise, nothing special, but it's hot." "Thank you," Mason said, genuinely touched by her hospitality. "I haven't slept under a proper roof in nearly a month." Fiona paused at the doorway. "May I ask where you're coming from, Mr. Hayes? Not just Sacramento, I imagine." Mason set his hat on the small bedside table. "I was working at a ranch near Placerville. Before that, Montana Territory. Before that." He shrugged. "I tend not to stay in one place too long." She studied him for a moment. "Well, Mr. Hayes, for tonight at least you have a place to rest. Good night." "Good night, Mrs. Fiona," he corrected himself. "And thank you again for the music. It's been a long time since I heard something so beautiful." After she left, Mason sat on the edge of the bed, removing his boots with a sigh of relief. Through the thin walls, he could hear Fiona moving about in what must be her quarters. Then, softly, she began to sing again, not a performance this time, but a gentle lullaby, perhaps a habit from her solitary evenings. Mason lay back, letting the melody wash over him as he drifted toward sleep. He'd be gone by mid-morning, continuing his journey south. But for now, he allowed himself to appreciate this unexpected shelter and the strange, sad music of a widow singing to memories. Morning arrived with pale light filtering through the worn curtains. Mason woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where he was. The sound of movement downstairs and the smell of coffee reminded him. He dressed quickly, running a hand through his dark hair in a half-hearted attempt at grooming, and descended to the saloon. Fiona was at the stove in a small kitchen area behind the bar, her copper hair twisted into a practical knot at the nape of her neck. She looked up as he entered. "Good morning. I hope you slept well. Better than I have in weeks, Mason admitted. That bed felt like heaven after sleeping on the ground. She smiled, gesturing for him to sit at one of the tables. Coffee's ready and I've got biscuits and some bacon. Nothing fancy. Sounds like a feast to me. Mason accepted the steaming mug she offered. You're very kind to a stranger, Mrs. Fiona, he corrected himself again. She brought over a plate of food. Kindness is in short supply these days. Besides, it's nice to have someone to cook for again. As they ate, Mason found himself studying her in the morning light. The sorrow he'd sensed last night was still present in her eyes, but there was strength there too, a resilience that impressed him. She caught him looking and raised an eyebrow. "Pardon me," he said, embarrassed. "It's just, do you have any help here? Running this place alone must be difficult." "I had a man who helped with the heavy work, and a girl from town who waited tables when we were busy," Fiona explained. "But they left when most everyone else did. There's only about 20 folks still in Skidoo, mostly old-timers who have nowhere else to go or who still believe the silver will come back." She took a sip of her coffee. "What about you, Mr. Hayes? You said you're bound for Tombstone." Mason nodded. "I've got a job waiting with the Butterfield Ranch. They need experienced men for a cattle drive to Colorado. You've been a cowboy long, since I was 16. Started as a stable boy in St. Louis, learned to ride and headed west when I was 18. That was 12 years ago." He didn't mention the war, the things he'd seen as a boy, too young to be a soldier but old enough to serve as a messenger. Those memories belonged to another life. Fiona seemed to sense his omission but didn't press. "And no family waiting for you somewhere?" "None to speak of," Mason replied. "My mother passed when I was young. My father, well, we parted ways long ago." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes. Mason found himself reluctant to finish his meal, knowing he should be on his way once he did. Outside, the day was warming rapidly. It would be scorching by noon, typical for the California desert in August. "I should get moving," he said finally, rising. "Thank you for the meal and the room. What do I owe you?" Fiona waved away his offer to pay. "As I said, consider it thanks for your attentive ears. It's been a long time since anyone really listened." "Then I'm doubly in your debt," Mason said, gathering his hat. "If you're ever in Arizona territory and need anything, ask for me at the Butterfield spread. I'll be there at least until spring." She walked him to the door. "Safe travels, Mr. Hayes." Outside, Mason untied his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Chance, and checked his saddle and packs. As he mounted up, he found himself glancing back at the saloon. Fiona stood in the doorway, her slim figure silhouetted against the dim interior. He raised his hand in farewell, and she returned the gesture. As he guided Chance onto the dusty road leading south, Mason couldn't shake the feeling that he was leaving something important behind. Ridiculous, he told himself. He'd spent one night listening to a widow sing, shared a meal, and now he was riding on just as he always did. He had obligations in Tombstone, a job waiting, money to be earned. Yet the memory of Fiona's voice followed him, haunting in its beauty and sorrow. By midday, he found himself calculating the distance to Tombstone, the time it would take, wondering if a delay of a day or two would matter much. The cattle drive wouldn't leave until September after all. "You're a fool, Hayes," he muttered to himself as he reached a fork in the road. To the left lay the most direct route south. To the right, a longer path that would circle back toward Skidoo if a man were so inclined. Chance tossed his head as if offering his opinion. "I know," Mason said, patting the horse's neck. "Just a thought." He took the left fork, forcing himself to focus on the journey ahead. Yet throughout the day, as the sun arced across the sky and the desert stretched endlessly around him, his thoughts kept returning to the empty saloon and the woman who sang to ghosts. By evening, he'd made good progress, setting up camp near a small spring. As he built his fire and prepared a simple meal, the silence pressed in around him. He'd spent years alone on the trail, comfortable with his own company, but tonight the solitude felt heavier somehow. After eating, Mason pulled out his harmonica, a battered thing he'd carried since his army days. He wasn't particularly skilled, but the simple tunes helped pass the long evenings. Tonight, he found himself trying to recreate one of Fiona's melodies, the notes falling short of the beauty he remembered but bringing comfort nonetheless. He slept restlessly, dreaming of a room full of empty chairs and a voice that called to him across a distance he couldn't cross. Morning brought clarity, or perhaps surrender. Mason packed his camp quickly and mounted up. "What do you say, Chance? Should we take the scenic route after all?" the horse snorted, which Mason chose to interpret as agreement. It took him most of the day to circle back toward Skidoo, and the sun was setting when he finally spotted the town's scattered buildings in the distance. He told himself he was just passing through again, perhaps would stay one more night before truly heading south. But even as he formed the thought, he knew it for the lie it was. As he approached the saloon, Mason saw light in the windows and heard Fiona's voice, stronger tonight, singing a livelier tune than those she'd chosen before. He dismounted, tied Chance to the hitching post, and straightened his dusty clothes as best he could. Taking a deep breath, he pushed through the bat wing doors. The scene inside stopped him cold. The saloon was no longer empty. At least a dozen people occupied the tables, and behind the bar stood not only Fiona but an older man serving drinks. Fiona herself was on the small stage, her copper hair loose around her shoulders, her face animated as she sang a popular frontier ballad. She spotted Mason and faltered momentarily, surprise flashing across her features before she recovered and finished the song with a flourish. The small crowd applauded enthusiastically. Fiona curtsied, then stepped down from the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, a short break while I rest my voice. Tom will keep your glasses full." She made her way through the tables toward Mason, who stood awkwardly by the door, hat in hand. "Mr. Hayes," she said, reaching him, "you're back sooner than expected." "I found myself thinking the direct route to Tombstone looked awfully dull," he replied, trying for lightness. "Thought I might delay a day or two." He glanced around the now bustling saloon. "Seems I've missed some developments." Fiona smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face. "Quite a few. Come sit. Let me get you a drink and I'll explain." She led him to a table in the corner, signaling to the barman, who brought over 2 glasses of whiskey. "After you left yesterday morning, I had a visitor," Fiona began. "Thomas Mercer, the assayer from the mine." She nodded toward the man behind the bar. "He came to tell me they'd found a new vein smaller than the main strike, but promising enough to keep the operation going. The company's bringing back some of the miners who left, and they're hiring new ones." Mason took a sip of his whiskey. "That's fortunate timing." "It is," she agreed. "Tom offered to help me reopen the saloon properly, said the men would need somewhere to spend their pay." Her eyes sparkled with animation that hadn't been there during his previous visit. "We sent word to the neighboring towns that the Thornton saloon was back in business, and people started arriving this afternoon." She gestured to the crowd. "Not a full house yet, but it's a start." "You must be relieved," Mason said, genuinely pleased for her despite a twinge of something like disappointment. In just a day, her circumstances had changed dramatically, eliminating any notion he might have had about. About what, exactly, he wasn't sure. "I am," Fiona confirmed. "It feels like Edward is still looking out for me somehow." She studied Mason's face. But you haven't told me why you really came back, Mr. Hayes. I doubt it was to check on the fortunes of a widow you barely know." Mason shifted in his seat, suddenly self-conscious. "I found myself thinking about your singing," he admitted. "It's been a long time since I heard music that moved me so. I thought perhaps I could listen a while longer before continuing south." Fiona's expression softened. "Well, you've arrived on a very different night than the one you left. I'm singing for paying customers now, not empty chairs. I can see that, and I'm glad for you." Mason finished his whiskey. "I should find a place to camp for the night. I don't want to take up a room you might rent to someone else." "Nonsense," Fiona said firmly. "The rooms are still empty. Most of these folks are from nearby. They'll ride home after closing. You're welcome to stay again." She glanced toward the stage. "I should get back to performing, but I'm glad you returned, Mr. Hayes." Mason watched her walk back to the stage, greeting patrons as she went. She looked different tonight, not just because of the loose hair or the more colorful dress, but because hope had replaced resignation in her bearing. She began another song, this one a romantic ballad that had the rough miners and cowboys listening raptly, some mouthing the words along with her. As the evening progressed, Mason nursed his drinks and observed the transformation of the place he'd seen so empty just a day before. Fiona was a natural hostess, moving between singing and helping behind the bar, remembering names and preferences, making everyone feel welcome. The barman, Tom, was equally adept, keeping the drinks flowing and mediating a minor dispute before it could escalate. By midnight, the crowd had thinned considerably. Fiona sang a final song, a gentle lullaby that reminded Mason of what he'd heard through the wall the night before, and thanked everyone for coming. As the last patrons departed, she slumped onto a chair beside Mason, her weariness now evident. "That," she said, "was exhausting, but wonderful." "You were magnificent," Mason told her honestly. "Not just the singing, but the way you handled everyone. This place will be thriving again in no time." She smiled tiredly. "I hope so. Edward would be pleased." She studied Mason's face. "You watched all night. Was it what you hoped for when you decided to return?" Mason considered the question carefully. "I'm not entirely sure what I hoped for," he admitted, "but seeing you in your element was certainly worth the detour." Fiona's expression turned thoughtful. "Why don't you help me and Tom clean up? Then perhaps we can talk a bit more." They worked efficiently, clearing tables, washing glasses, sweeping the floor. Tom bid them good night around 1 o'clock, heading to his home in town with promises to return the next afternoon. When he'd gone, Fiona poured 2 final drinks and motioned for Mason to join her at a corner table. "So tell me, Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice gentle in the now quiet saloon. "What really brought you back to Skidoo?" Mason looked down at his glass, gathering his thoughts. "I've been wandering for a long time," he said finally. "Moving from job to job, town to town. It suited me, or I thought it did." He met her eyes. "Then I heard you singing to an empty room with such heart and hope despite everything. It made me wonder what I've been running from all these years." Fiona reached across the table and touched his hand briefly. "And have you figured it out?" "Not entirely," Mason admitted. "But I know that for the first time in a long while I was reluctant to ride away from somewhere." He gave her a rueful smile. "Foolish, probably. We're strangers, after all." "Perhaps not as much as you think," Fiona said softly. "I recognized something in you last night, Mr. Hayes, a familiar solitude." She sipped her drink. "Edward and I were happy, truly, but even with him there was a part of me that felt set apart. I think that's why I kept singing after he died, even with no audience. Some feelings can only be expressed in music." Mason nodded, understanding perfectly. "I feel most myself when I'm riding alone under an open sky, but lately That solitude has started to feel less like freedom and more like exile, Fiona suggested. Something like that. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the connection between them deepening without words. Finally, Fiona stood. "It's late, and it's been quite a day. Your room is waiting for you if you still want it." "Thank you," Mason said, rising as well. "I should continue on tomorrow, make up for lost time." Fiona nodded, though her expression showed a hint of disappointment. Of course. Tombstone is still waiting after all. They climbed the stairs together, pausing outside the door to Mason's room. "Good night, Mr. Hayes," Fiona said, extending her hand formally. Mason took it, holding it perhaps a moment longer than necessary. "Good night, Fiona, and thank you for sharing your music." She slipped her hand from his and continued down the hall to her own room. Mason watched her go, then entered his room, suddenly exhausted. As he prepared for bed, he could hear Fiona moving about next door, and soon, faintly, she began to sing that same lullaby. This time he knew it was meant for him to hear. In the morning, Mason woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Fiona's voice downstairs, speaking to someone. He dressed quickly and descended to find her in conversation with a wiry man in work clothes, one of the returning miners, by the look of him. "Ah, Mr. Hayes," Fiona said as she spotted him. "Good morning. This is Mr. Jenkins, one of our regulars from before. He's just back from Nevada and was telling me about the new operations at the mine." Jenkins tipped his hat to Mason. "Morning. You staying in town long?" "Just passing through," Mason replied, accepting the cup of coffee Fiona offered. "Heading to Arizona Territory." "Shame," Jenkins said. "Mine's hiring experienced men. Pays good, too." Mason glanced at Fiona, who was watching him with an unreadable expression. "I've got work waiting in Tombstone," he said, though even to his own ears his voice lacked conviction. "Well, offer stands if you change your mind," Jenkins said, rising. "Thanks for the coffee, Mrs. Thornton. I'll be back this evening with some of the boys." After he left, Fiona busied herself preparing breakfast. "The biscuits are almost ready," she said over her shoulder. "I hope you slept well." "Very well, thank you." Mason sat at the same table they'd shared the morning before. "Sounds like the town is coming back to life quickly." "It is." Fiona brought over plates of food. "Mr. Jenkins says they're expecting at least 30 miners back within the week. The company is even talking about expanding the operation if the new vein proves as rich as they hope." Mason nodded, trying to summon enthusiasm for her good fortune. "That's excellent news." Fiona studied him as they ate. "You seem troubled this morning, Mr. Hayes." He set down his fork. "Not troubled exactly, just thinking about Tombstone, among other things." Mason met her eyes. "I meant what I said about continuing on today. But I find myself reluctant to leave." Fiona's expression softened. "Because of my singing." "Because of you," Mason said simply. "I know it's forward of me to say so, especially given your recent loss, but in all my wandering I've rarely felt as drawn to a place or a person as I do here." Color rose in Fiona's cheeks, but she held his gaze steadily. "That's quite a declaration from someone who's known me less than 2 days." "I'm not proposing marriage," Mason clarified quickly. "Just explaining why leaving today suddenly seems like the wrong choice." He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated with his inability to express himself clearly. "I've spent my life moving on whenever things got complicated. Maybe it's time I stopped running." Fiona was silent for a long moment. "The mine is hiring," she said finally. "And I could use help around here, especially if business continues to improve." She spoke carefully, as if measuring each word. "If you wanted to delay your journey a bit longer, there would be work for you." Mason felt a weight lift from his chest. "Are you offering me a job, Mrs. Thornton?" "I'm offering you a reason to stay, Mr. Hayes," she replied, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "What you make of it is up to you." "I've never tended bar before," Mason warned, "but I'm a quick learner." "I've no doubt." Fiona's smile widened. "And perhaps in the evenings after closing you might play that harmonica I heard you practicing last night. I could use accompaniment for some of my songs." Mason laughed, surprised. "You heard that? The walls are thin," she reminded him. "And you weren't bad, just a bit rusty." "Then it seems I have 2 job offers in Skidoo," Mason said, finding himself smiling more genuinely than he had in months. "I'd be a fool to ride on without at least exploring the possibilities." "Indeed you would, Mr. Hayes." Fiona rose, collecting their empty plates. "Now, if you're staying, there's work to be done. The saloon needs a thorough cleaning before we open this afternoon, and I could use a strong back to move some crates from the storeroom." Just like that, the decision was made. Mason spent the morning helping Fiona prepare the saloon for business, cleaning windows, moving furniture, and taking inventory of the supplies. They worked well together, establishing an easy rhythm as if they'd been partners for years instead of mere acquaintances. By mid-afternoon, the saloon was ready. Tom arrived to take his place behind the bar, raising an eyebrow at Mason's presence, but accepting Fiona's brief explanation that he'd be helping out for a while. Customers began trickling in soon after, mostly miners fresh off their shifts, dusty and thirsty. Mason found himself enjoying the work more than he'd expected. The conversations, the stories exchanged across the bar, the sense of being part of something rather than just passing through it all felt surprisingly right. And always, there was Fiona, moving through the room with grace and warmth, occasionally catching his eye with a smile that seemed meant just for him. When evening came and the saloon filled, Fiona took to the stage again. Tonight, her performance felt different to Mason, more joyful, less like a memorial to what had been lost. The patrons responded enthusiastically, calling for favorites and applauding each song. From his position helping Tom at the bar, Mason watched with growing admiration. During a break in her singing, Fiona approached the bar. "How are you finding your new occupation, Mr. Hayes?" she asked, her eyes twinkling. "Enlightening," he replied, pouring her a glass of water, "though I still think my real talent lies with horses rather than whiskey." "Perhaps tomorrow you can ride out to the livery and see if they need help there as well," Fiona suggested. "A man of your experience could likely find plenty of work in Skidoo now that things are looking up." Mason nodded, considering the idea. "I might do that, and perhaps—" He hesitated, then pressed on. "Perhaps this evening after closing I could try accompanying one of your songs, if you were serious about that offer." Fiona's smile was answer enough. "I was entirely serious, Mr. Hayes. I think our talents might complement each other quite well." The evening continued in much the same pleasant fashion as the night before, though the crowd was larger and stayed later. By the time the last patron left, well after midnight, Mason was exhausted but strangely invigorated. Tom bid them good night, and once again, he and Fiona were left alone in the quiet saloon. "Shall we try that duet now?" Fiona suggested, settling herself at the piano that stood in the corner of the room. "I noticed you had your harmonica in your pocket all night." Mason pulled out the instrument, suddenly nervous. "I'm not very accomplished," he warned her again. "Neither is this piano," Fiona replied, running her fingers over the keys, which were indeed slightly out of tune. "But together, perhaps we can make something worthwhile." She began to play a simple melody, one of the songs she'd performed earlier in the evening. Mason listened carefully, then joined in hesitantly, finding the complementary notes. After a few false starts and some laughter, they managed to establish a harmony that, while far from perfect, carried a certain charm. When the song ended, Fiona looked up at him with bright eyes. "Not bad for a first attempt, Mr. Hayes." "Mason," he said suddenly. "If we're going to be making music together, you should call me Mason." "Mason," she repeated, his name soft on her lips. "And how long do you think we'll be making music together?" It was a loaded question, and they both knew it. Mason considered his answer carefully. "I'd say that depends on how long you're willing to put up with my amateur playing, and how long Skidoo holds possibilities worth exploring." Fiona nodded, accepting the cautious response. "Fair enough. For now, let's try another song." They continued playing for nearly an hour, their musical partnership improving with each attempt. It was well past 1 in the morning when Fiona finally closed the piano lid. "We should get some rest," she said. "Tomorrow will be another busy day." As they climbed the stairs together, Mason felt a contentment he hadn't experienced in years. At his door, he turned to her. "Thank you, Fiona, for the music and for the chance to stay." She regarded him thoughtfully. "You know, when you first walked into my empty saloon, I thought you were just another drifter passing through. I never imagined you'd still be here 3 days later." "Neither did I," Mason admitted, "but I'm glad I am." "So am I," Fiona said softly. "Good night, Mason." "Good night, Fiona." The next few weeks fell into a comfortable pattern. During the day, Mason split his time between helping at the saloon and working at the livery stable, where his experience with horses had indeed been welcomed. In the evenings, he helped Tom tend bar while Fiona sang, and after closing, he and Fiona would practice their duets, growing more skilled and adventurous with each session. The town of Skidoo flourished as the mine operations expanded. New faces appeared daily: miners, merchants, and their families. The saloon thrived, with Fiona's singing becoming a renowned attraction that drew customers from neighboring settlements. And through it all, Mason and Fiona's relationship deepened, moving beyond employer and employee, beyond musical partners, into something neither of them had named but both increasingly valued. They shared meals, stories, occasional touches that lingered just a moment too long to be casual. Mason found himself looking for excuses to be near her, to make her laugh, to learn more about the remarkable woman who had changed the course of his life with a song. One evening in late September, nearly a month after Mason had first ridden into Skidoo, a stranger arrived at the saloon, a well-dressed man who watched Fiona's performance with professional interest. After her final song, he approached her, introducing himself as Lawrence Phillips, a representative of a San Francisco theater company. "Mrs. Thornton," Mason overheard him saying, "your talent is exceptional. We're currently assembling a touring company to perform across California and Nevada. I'd like to offer you a position as our featured vocalist." Mason felt his stomach tighten as he wiped down the bar, trying not to obviously eavesdrop. Fiona's surprise was evident in her expression. "That's very flattering, Mr. Phillips," she replied, "but I have responsibilities here." "This saloon would be well cared for, I'm sure," Phillips interjected smoothly. "And the compensation would be substantial, more than enough to hire management for this establishment while you're away." He handed her a card. "Think about it. We'll be in the area for 3 days before continuing to San Francisco. It's a rare opportunity for someone of your talent." After Phillips left, Fiona returned to the bar, her expression troubled. Mason tried to sound casual. "Quite an offer." "Yes," she agreed distractedly, "though not one I was expecting." "Will you consider it?" Mason asked, his heart beating uncomfortably fast as he waited for her answer. Fiona met his eyes. "I don't know. A month ago I might have jumped at the chance. Now." She glanced around the busy saloon, then back at Mason. "Things are different now." Before Mason could respond, Tom called him to help with a large order. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of activity, with no chance for further private conversation. By closing time, Mason was wound tight with anxiety, imagining Fiona leaving for San Francisco, perhaps never returning to Skidoo or to him. When the last customers departed, Fiona approached him as he swept the floor. "No music tonight," she said apologetically. "I'm exhausted and I have a lot to think about." Mason nodded, trying to hide his disappointment. "Of course, it's been a long day." They cleaned in silence, the easy companionship of recent weeks replaced by an awkward tension. When they finished, Fiona hesitated at the foot of the stairs. "Mason, about Mr. Phillips's offer, you don't owe me any explanations," Mason interrupted. "It's a wonderful opportunity. You should consider it carefully." Fiona studied his face. "And if I did accept, what would you do?" The question caught him off guard. I'm not sure." "Stay here, I suppose, at least for a while. The liveries offered me a permanent position." "I see." Fiona's expression gave nothing away. "Well, as I said, I have some thinking to do. Good night, Mason." He watched her climb the stairs, fighting the urge to call her back, to tell her how the thought of her leaving filled him with a dread he hadn't felt since the war. But what right did he have? They were friends, perhaps, business associates certainly, but he'd never presumed to claim more, despite his growing feelings. Mason slept poorly that night, his dreams troubled by images of Fiona singing on distant stages, fading from his reach. He woke before dawn, feeling as restless as he had during his wandering days. Dressing quietly, he decided a ride might clear his head. The stable was just opening when he arrived. The owner, Hank Mitchell, looked surprised to see him so early. "Everything all right, Hayes?" "Just needed some air," Mason replied, saddling Chance. "Thought I'd ride out to the ridge before starting work." Hank nodded knowingly. "Heard about the offer Mrs. Thornton got. Town's buzzing with it already." News traveled fast in small places like Skidoo. Mason mounted up without commenting, guiding Chance out of town as the sun began to rise. He rode hard, letting the physical exertion and the beauty of the desert morning push his troubled thoughts aside for a while. At the ridge overlooking Skidoo, Mason dismounted, letting Chance graze while he sat on a boulder and watched the town come to life below. From this distance, Skidoo looked almost picturesque, the scattered buildings golden in the early light, smoke rising from chimneys, tiny figures moving about their business. A month ago, it had been just another dusty outpost on his journey to somewhere else. Now, improbably, it felt like home. And at the center of that feeling was Fiona, with her copper hair and resilient spirit, her music that had stopped him in his tracks that first night. Mason pulled out his harmonica and played softly, one of the songs they'd practiced together, imagining her voice joining the melody as it had so many evenings now. The thought of those evenings ending, of returning to the solitude that had been his constant companion for so long, was suddenly unbearable. "I thought I might find you here." Mason turned sharply. Fiona stood a few yards away, her horse tethered to a scrub pine nearby. She wore a simple riding outfit, her hair braided against the morning breeze, and she looked so beautiful it made his chest ache. "Fiona," he said, rising. "How did you know where to look?" "Hank told me." She approached, stopping beside him on the ridge. "He said you seemed troubled this morning." "I thought I knew why." Mason put away his harmonica. "I just needed some air, as did I." Fiona gazed out at the town below. "I've been up most of the night thinking about Mr. Phillips's offer." Mason braced himself. "And have you decided?" "I have." She turned to face him fully. "But first, I need to know something, Mason. Why did you really come back to Skidoo that second day? The truth this time." He met her eyes, knowing honesty was the only possible response. Because in all my years of wandering, I'd never heard anything as beautiful as your voice singing to an empty room. Because when I rode away, I felt like I was leaving something essential behind." He took a deep breath. "Because something in me recognized something in you, and for the first time in my life, running felt like the wrong choice." Fiona's expression softened. "And now, after a month here working together, making music together, what do you feel now?" "Now I know I was right to stay," Mason said simply. "Being here with you makes more sense than anything has in a very long time. The thought of that ending." He shook his head. "But I have no claim on you, Fiona. If San Francisco is what you want, it isn't," she interrupted, stepping closer. "Do you know what I realized last night? Edward and I built that saloon together, and after he died, I thought keeping it going was my duty to his memory. But these past weeks, working with you, making music with you, I've started seeing it as my own place, not just his legacy." Her voice grew softer. "And I've started seeing a future in Skidoo that has nothing to do with the past and everything to do with what might be possible." Hope rose in Mason's chest. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm not going to San Francisco," Fiona replied, a smile breaking across her face. "I'm staying in Skidoo, and I'm hoping very much that you'll stay too." Mason's restraint finally broke. He closed the distance between them, taking her hands in his. "Fiona Thornton, I have no intention of going anywhere without you." Her smile widened. "That's fortunate, Mr. Hayes, because I've grown quite accustomed to your harmonica playing. It would be a shame to have to break in a new musician." Mason laughed, relief and joy flooding through him. "Is that all you've grown accustomed to?" "No," Fiona said softly, her eyes serious now. "Not at all." He leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, but she moved toward him instead, and when their lips met, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Her hands slipped from his to rest against his chest as he cradled her face gently. When they finally separated, Fiona's eyes were bright with emotion. "I never expected this when you walked into my saloon that night," she whispered. "I was singing to ghosts, and somehow you heard me." "I'll always hear you," Mason promised, drawing her closer, "for as long as you want to sing." They stood together on the ridge as the sun climbed higher. The town of Skidoo spread below them like a promise of what their future might hold. Eventually, they would ride back down, return to their work, to the life they were building day by day. But for now, they remained on the overlook, watching the desert bloom with light, a harmony as perfect as any they'd created with music. The autumn months passed in a blur of activity and deepening affection. Mason officially took over as manager of the saloon, freeing Fiona to focus on her performances, which grew more elaborate and popular as word of her talent spread throughout the region. Together, they expanded the establishment, adding rooms for travelers and a small dining area serving simple but hearty meals. Their musical partnership flourished as well. Mason's harmonica playing improved under Fiona's patient guidance, and soon they were performing duets that drew enthusiastic applause from the saloon patrons. On quiet nights after closing, they would experiment with new songs, sometimes ones Fiona had composed herself, filling the once empty room with harmonies that spoke of their growing love. By November, their relationship had become common knowledge in Skidoo, generally met with approval and occasional good-natured teasing. Tom, who had become something of a friend to them both, often remarked that he'd never seen two people more obviously meant for each other. "When are you going to make it official?" he asked Mason one evening as they restocked the bar while Fiona chatted with customers. "The whole town's been taking bets." Mason glanced across the room at Fiona, her copper hair gleaming in the lamplight as she laughed at something a miner's wife had said. "Soon," he replied. "Very soon." The opportunity came on a crisp December evening. Business was slow due to a light snowfall, unusual for the region, but not unheard of at higher elevations. Fiona had just finished a song for the handful of patrons when the door opened, admitting a gust of cold air and Lawrence Phillips, the theater agent who had offered her the San Francisco position months before. "Mrs. Thornton," Phillips said, removing his hat as he approached the stage. "I was passing through and thought I'd see if you might have reconsidered my offer. Our current vocalist is leaving the company and the position remains open." Fiona stepped down from the stage, smiling politely. "It's good to see you again, Mr. Phillips, but my answer hasn't changed. My place is here in Skidoo." Phillips glanced around the half-empty saloon. "Even with such a limited audience for your considerable talent." "The audience is just fine," Mason interjected, moving to Fiona's side. "And getting larger all the time." Phillips raised an eyebrow, noting their proximity. "I see. Well, Mrs. Thornton, should you ever change your mind, the offer stands." He replaced his hat. "Though I suspect that's becoming increasingly unlikely." After he left, Fiona turned to Mason with a bemused expression. "He seemed to think there was something keeping me here beyond my attachment to the saloon." "I wonder what gave him that idea," Mason replied, slipping an arm around her waist. The casual affection felt natural now, after months of gradually increasing closeness. "Perhaps the fact that you were practically glowing when you looked at me just now," Fiona laughed, leaning into him slightly. "Was I that obvious, completely?" Mason pressed a kiss to her temple. "Not that I'm complaining." The evening wound down early due to the weather. After the last customers departed, Mason and Fiona sat together at the piano, as had become their custom, working on a new song she was composing. The saloon was warm and quiet, snow falling gently outside the windows, creating a cocoon of intimacy around them. As Fiona played the final notes of the melody, Mason reached into his pocket, his heart suddenly racing. "That's beautiful," he said, "but I think it needs something more." "Oh," Fiona raised an eyebrow. "What did you have in mind?" Mason withdrew a small box, placing it on the piano keys. "This." Fiona's hand stilled on the keyboard. She stared at the box, then at Mason, her eyes widening. "Mason, I rode to Carson City last week," he explained, opening the box to reveal a simple gold band set with a small sapphire. "Tom covered for me. He's been in on the secret all along." Fiona's eyes filled with tears. "Is this what I think it is?" Mason took her hands in his. "Fiona Thornton, when I rode into Skidoo that night and heard you singing to empty chairs, something changed in me. For the first time in my life, I wanted to stay put, to build something lasting." He squeezed her hands gently. "You gave me a home when I didn't know I was looking for one. You gave me music when my life had been silent for too long. And you gave me your heart when I'd almost forgotten I had one to offer in return." A tear slipped down Fiona's cheek. "Mason Hayes, you impossible man. Are you going to ask the question or just make me cry all night?" Mason laughed, relief and love swelling in his chest. "Fiona, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my days listening to your songs and trying my best to accompany them?" "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking on the word. "Yes, I will marry you, Mason." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms, kissing her with all the love and gratitude he felt. When they finally separated, Fiona rested her forehead against his. "I never thought I'd find love again," she murmured. "Especially not with a drifter who just happened to hear me singing to ghosts." "I'm not drifting anymore," Mason reminded her. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." They were married on Christmas Day, 1878, in the newly built church of Skidoo. The small structure was packed with well-wishers, miners, merchants, and travelers who had come to know and appreciate them both. Tom stood as Mason's best man, while the mine assayer's wife, Martha Jenkins, attended Fiona. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. Mason, dressed in a new suit purchased for the occasion, watched in awe as Fiona walked down the aisle in a gown of pale blue silk, her copper hair crowned with winter flowers. When they exchanged vows, his voice was steady, certain in a way he'd never been before meeting her. "I, Mason Hayes, take you, Fiona Thornton, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he said, holding her hands in his. "I promise to cherish your songs, to share your silences, and to build our life together day by day, note by note." Fiona's eyes shone as she made her own promises. "I, Fiona Thornton, take you, Mason Hayes, as my lawfully wedded husband. I will sing for you in good times and in hard times, and I will listen for your harmony in all the music we make together." The reception was held at the saloon, transformed for the occasion with evergreen boughs and ribbon. Fiona sang for the guests, her voice more beautiful than ever, and Mason accompanied her on his harmonica, their musical partnership now a symbol of their union. They danced under paper lanterns, laughed with friends, and began their married life surrounded by the community that had embraced them both. That night, in the privacy of the rooms above the saloon now expanded and renovated to become their proper home, they came together as husband and wife, their love expressed in whispered words and tender touches. Afterward, Fiona lay in Mason's arms, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "Happy, Mrs. Hayes?" Mason asked, stroking her hair. Fiona smiled against his skin. "Happier than I ever imagined possible." She propped herself up to look at him. "When Edward died, I thought that part of my life was over. I never expected to find love again, especially not with a dusty cowboy who wandered into my saloon." "I'm glad I did," Mason said, drawing her close again. "Though I still don't know what made me stop that night. I've passed plenty of saloons without going in." "It was fate," Fiona declared. "Or perhaps Edward looking out for me still." She kissed Mason softly. "Either way, I'm grateful." Spring brought new developments to Skidoo and to the Hayes household. The town continued to grow as the mine prospered, attracting more families and businesses. The saloon, now officially renamed Fiona's, had become known throughout the region for its good food, fair prices, and exceptional entertainment. In April, Fiona shared news that filled Mason with both joy and trepidation. They were expecting a child, due in late autumn. The pregnancy brought changes to their routine. Fiona reduced her performances as her condition advanced, and Mason took on more responsibilities at the saloon. But the months of preparation were among the happiest of their lives as they anticipated the expansion of their family. In November 1879, exactly 1 year after Mason's proposal, Fiona gave birth to a son they named Samuel Edward Hayes, honoring both Mason's father and Fiona's first husband. The baby had Fiona's copper hair and Mason's serious eyes, a perfect blend of them both. On Samuel's 1-month birthday, as winter settled over Skidoo once again, Mason entered the saloon after checking on a shipment of supplies to find Fiona sitting on the stage, cradling their son and singing softly to him. Around her, the chairs stood empty. It was mid-afternoon, hours before opening, but the scene reminded Mason powerfully of that first night he'd seen her. Quietly, he took a seat in the same chair he'd occupied then, removing his hat and setting it on the table. Fiona looked up, smiling when she saw him. "We have an audience, Samuel," she whispered to the baby. "Your father's come to listen." "Don't stop on my account," Mason said, his heart full as he watched his wife and son. Fiona continued her lullaby, her voice as beautiful as ever, perhaps even more so now that it sang of a love multiplied. When the song ended, she rose carefully and brought Samuel to Mason. Would you like to hold him while I prepare for tonight? Tom will be here soon." Mason took his son in his arms, still marveling at how perfectly the small body fit against his chest. "We've come a long way since that first night, haven't we?" he said, looking up at Fiona. "When you were singing to empty chairs and I was just passing through." Fiona leaned down to kiss him, then Samuel's forehead. "A very long way," she agreed, "and I wouldn't change a single step of the journey." That evening, after Samuel was settled in his cradle upstairs, Fiona performed for the usual crowd of miners, merchants, and travelers. Mason watched from behind the bar, pride swelling in his chest as her voice filled the room that was once so empty. When she finished her set, she joined him, slipping her hand into his. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, noticing his contemplative expression. "I'm thinking about how one decision can change everything," Mason replied. "If I hadn't stopped that night, if I hadn't come back the next day, if you hadn't offered me a reason to stay." He squeezed her hand. "I could have missed all of this." "But you didn't," Fiona reminded him. "You stopped, you listened, and you stayed." She looked around the busy saloon at the life they'd built together. "Some songs are meant to be heard, Mason, even when they're sung to empty chairs." "Especially then," Mason agreed, bringing her hand to his lips. "Especially then." As the years passed, the story of how Mason and Fiona met became something of a legend in Skidoo. People would ask to hear it, especially newcomers, and Fiona would laugh and say it sounded more romantic than it really was, just a tired cowboy and a lonely widow finding each other at the right moment. But Mason knew better. He knew that something extraordinary had happened that night when he heard Fiona's voice floating through the darkness. Something had called him to stop, to listen, to find the source of that beautiful sound. And in doing so, he'd found not just music but home, not just a resting place but a purpose. By 1885, the Hayes family had grown to include a daughter, Margaret Rose, born 2 years after Samuel. The saloon had expanded again, now incorporating a proper hotel on the upper floors, managed efficiently by Fiona while Mason oversaw the bar and dining room. They employed several staff now, including a cook and additional barkeeps, but Mason and Fiona remained the heart of the establishment. Fiona still sang 3 nights a week, her reputation bringing customers from as far away as San Francisco. On those evenings, Mason would accompany her on the harmonica, or sometimes the guitar, which he'd learned to play reasonably well over the years. Their musical partnership remained a symbol of their marriage, complementary talents creating something greater than either could produce alone. One night, after the children were asleep and the saloon had closed, Mason found Fiona sitting alone on the stage, much as she had been when he first saw her. The room was empty, chairs neatly arranged, waiting for the next day's customers. She wasn't singing this time, just sitting quietly, seemingly lost in thought. "Something troubling you, love?" Mason asked, joining her on the stage. Fiona smiled, reaching for his hand. "Not at all. I was just remembering how it all began." "Sometimes it seems like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like another lifetime entirely." 7 years next month," Mason noted, settling beside her. 7 years since I found you singing to empty chairs." "And decided to fill one," Fiona added. "Best audience I ever had." Mason chuckled. "I was just one man. Now you perform for packed houses." "Yes, but none of them listen quite like you did that night." Fiona leaned against him. "You heard what I was really singing about, not just the words, but the loneliness behind them." "I recognized it because I carried the same loneliness," Mason admitted. "Had been carrying it for years without even knowing." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, hands intertwined, the empty room around them a reminder of how far they'd come. "I got a letter today," Fiona said eventually. From Mr. Phillips in San Francisco. He's still trying to convince me to perform at his theater, at least for a special engagement." Mason wasn't surprised. The theater agent had become something of a regular visitor over the years, always with the same request. "And what did you tell him this time?" "The same thing I always tell him." Fiona turned to face Mason fully. "That my place is here, with my family and my saloon. That I don't need a bigger stage or a larger audience." She smiled, touching his cheek gently. "That I found everything I was looking for the night a dusty cowboy walked in and listened to me sing." Mason drew her into his arms, holding her close. "I'm the fortunate one," he murmured against her hair. "Finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me, Fiona Hayes." "Well then," she said, pulling back with a mischievous gleam in her eye, "perhaps we should celebrate our good fortune with a song, for old time's sake." And so, in the quiet of the empty saloon, they made music together, once more Fiona's clear voice and Mason's harmonica blending in perfect harmony, filling the space with the story of their love, witnessed only by the empty chairs that had brought them together. Outside, the town of Skidoo slept peacefully, the desert night wrapped around it like a blanket. Inside, two people who had once been strangers, then friends, then lovers, and finally family, created beauty from the silence, note by note, just as they had built their life together day by day, year by year, a journey that had begun with a song and a listener who had the wisdom to stay and hear it through to the end. In the years that followed, Mason and Fiona Hayes became fixtures in Skidoo. Their saloon and hotel thrived as the town grew into a respectable settlement, no longer just a mining outpost but a community with schools, churches, and businesses. Their children, Samuel and Margaret, grew up amid the bustle of the establishment, learning the value of hard work and the power of music from their parents' example. Mason never lost his wonder at the life he'd found so different from the solitary existence he'd known before. Sometimes, in quiet moments, he would remember the restless wanderer he'd been, always moving, never connecting. Now his days were filled with purpose and his nights with the comfort of Fiona's presence beside him. Fiona, too, marveled at the turns her life had taken. She had come west as a minister's daughter seeking adventure, found love with Edward only to lose him too soon, and then discovered an unexpected second chance with a man who had stopped to listen when she needed it most. In 1890, as Skidoo celebrated the construction of a rail line that would connect it more directly to Carson City and points beyond, Mason and Fiona stood together on the ridge where they had once declared their feelings. The town below had changed considerably: more buildings, more people, more signs of permanence where once there had been only tents and hasty constructions. "Remember when you found me up here that morning?" Mason asked, his arm around Fiona's shoulders. "When I was trying to decide whether to leave or stay," Fiona nodded, leaning into him. "I was terrified you'd choose to go. I'd only known you a month, but somehow the thought of Skidoo without you seemed impossible." "I'm glad you came looking for me," Mason said, pressing a kiss to her temple, now showing strands of silver among the copper. "Best decision I ever made was turning chance around and coming back to hear you sing again." They were interrupted by the sound of hooves. Samuel, now nearly 11 and as skilled a rider as his father, came galloping up the trail, his sister not far behind. At 9, Margaret was the image of her mother, with the same musical talent and independent spirit. "Pa, Ma," Samuel called, reining in his pony. "Uncle Tom says to tell you the new piano's arrived on the supply wagon. He says it's the finest one he's ever seen." Fiona's eyes lit up. The new piano had been Mason's anniversary gift to her, a proper concert instrument to replace the aging upright that had served the saloon for so many years. "We'd better get back then," she said, her excitement evident. "I want to try it before opening." The family rode down together, the children racing ahead while Mason and Fiona followed at a more sedate pace. As they approached the saloon, now an impressive two-story building with a fresh coat of paint and a sign proclaiming Fiona's Saloon and Hotel in elegant script, Mason felt a surge of pride. "We built something good here," he said, almost to himself. Fiona heard him and smiled. "Yes, we did. Something very good indeed." Inside, Tom supervised as workers positioned the gleaming piano on the stage. Fiona dismounted quickly, hurrying to inspect her gift. Her fingers ran lovingly over the polished wood, then tested the keys, her face rapturous at the rich sound. "It's magnificent," she breathed, looking up at Mason as he joined her. "How did you ever afford such a thing?" Mason grinned. "Been saving for a couple of years. A saloon with the best singer in Nevada deserves the best piano, too." Fiona beckoned him to sit beside her on the bench, then began to play, her fingers finding the melody of the first song they'd ever performed together. Without prompting, Mason took out his harmonica and joined in, the familiar tune now enhanced by the piano's superior tone. Samuel and Margaret, accustomed to their parents' impromptu performances, sat at a nearby table to listen, Samuel tapping his foot in rhythm while Margaret hummed along. Tom leaned against the bar, a smile on his weathered face as he watched the family that had become his own in all but name over the years. When the song ended, Fiona looked around the empty saloon, empty now but soon to be filled with the evening's patrons. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "sometimes I still think about that night, how different everything would have been if you hadn't walked through those doors." "I like to think I would have found you eventually," Mason replied. "Some things are just meant to be." Fiona laughed, the sound as musical as her singing. "Mason Hayes, when did you become such a romantic?" "The moment I heard you sing," he answered honestly, "and I've only gotten worse since then." That evening, as Fiona performed on her new piano to an appreciative audience, Mason watched from his usual spot near the bar, his heart full of gratitude. The years had been kind to them both. The saloon prospered, their children thrived, and their love had only deepened with time. Later, after closing when the children were asleep and the night's receipts counted, Mason found Fiona at the piano again, playing softly in the dimly lit room. He sat beside her without speaking, content to listen as her fingers moved over the keys. "What are you thinking about?" he asked finally when she paused. "I was thinking about empty chairs," Fiona replied, gesturing to the room around them, "and how sometimes what looks like an ending is really a beginning in disguise." Mason nodded, understanding perfectly. "When Edward died, you thought your story was over." "I did," Fiona agreed. "I was singing to ghosts because I couldn't imagine a future worth singing for." She turned to face him fully. "And then you walked in, and suddenly there were new songs to be sung." Mason took her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "I'm glad I was there to hear them. And I'm looking forward to all the songs still to come." Fiona leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. "As am I, my love, as am I." Outside, the stars wheeled above Skidoo, the same stars that had witnessed their first meeting, their growing love, their life built day by day from the most unexpected of beginnings. Inside, the empty chairs stood silent, no longer representing loss and loneliness, but rather potential spaces waiting to be filled with friends, family, and customers, all part of the rich tapestry their lives had become. And in the center of it all, a woman who had once sung to memories and a man who had stopped to listen, now making music together in perfect harmony, their love story still unfolding, note by note, in the heart of the Wild West they both now called home.